All right, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out, and I'd like to thank everybody for organizing and participating in the session. I think it's a very interesting topic, and also a very important topic as well. And so I'll be looking at leisure and happiness, and looking at how I predict that what we see now and what we'll see in the future is a degendering of the experience. And so when looking at the connection between leisure and happiness, you can say that it's a known relation. And by a known relation, we're looking at studies show that leisure provides opportunities for such things as enjoyment, engagement, relaxation, and productivity, all of which provide us opportunities for personal happiness. So there is a relationship there. It's an unknown relationship at the same time because work and happiness tends to be studied a lot more compared to leisure and happiness. So overall, we can say the connection between leisure and happiness is relatively understudied, especially in the United States. If you do want to find research on leisure and happiness, typically the research will come from Canada, it'll come from Australia, and Scandinavian countries, cultures all of which focus on leisure and work compared to our culture that tends to focus more on the work side of the coin. It's also a complex relationship. And by a complex relationship, we can say that researchers and respondents to research questions often interpret what we mean by leisure differently. And so that makes it difficult to really compare studies and really understand what's going on when one researcher conceptualizes leisure as one thing and another researcher conceptualizes it as something else. And also respondents can interpret it differently. So different interpretations can be seen in men and women. Often women will include childcare as a form of leisure, but men will not. So another complex part of the relationship is how it's measured. So it's really problematic, and I'm using data today from two different data sets, and they actually measure leisure differently. One looks at free time, other looks at leisure activities. It makes it difficult again to generalize, makes it difficult again to compare studies. And finally, we can look at the quality of leisure, because when it comes to producing happiness, not all leisure forms are equal. In other words, think about watching television compared to socializing with friends, socializing with family members. People are more likely to produce happiness through activities, socializing with friends and family, compared to watching a TV show in isolation. So not all leisure forms are equal when looking at it producing happiness. So the issue we can look at is what we call leisure and the gender gap. Specifically, what we see is men experience more leisure time in the United States compared to women. So that's the issue, and it's an important issue because it's an issue of inequality. Women compared to men are facing more barriers when it comes to experiencing happiness. Women compared to men are experiencing more barriers when it comes to achieving a higher quality of life. And so this is a little bit of an overview of what I'll be doing throughout the rest of my talk. First, looking at the issue historically, and then I'm going to get into how the gap is closing, and then I'm going to theorize the closing gap, kind of look at it now and look at it in the future, and then a few consequences of the changes. So to begin, we can look at the leisure practice historically in terms of the overall trend we see beginning in modernity, which historically speaking we can say is around the 1700s to today. So when looking at modernity around the 1700s to today, basically we see a trend of an overall decrease of leisure for all people. And you can see this on many points. You can look at calendars in terms of holidays being practiced. You can look at number of days off work over time. And when you look at days off work and holidays together, what's interesting to see that even the same holidays we have now are shorter in length compared to the same holiday kind of 100, 200 years ago. And a lot of people don't know that for a long time, Christmas and New Year's Eve was basically one big celebration, although separate celebrations in terms of a starting and stopping point. Basically, it was like a Mardi Gras. And most celebrations were like that in terms of holidays weren't a single day, multiple days per week, week-long celebrations, and you would not be working. but you don't see this anymore, and that contributes to this overall trend of less time to leisure compared to the past. But when looking at the trend specifically, we can see that it's had a greater influence on women. In other words, women have been hit harder when it comes to the decrease of leisure time compared to men. Here we see that creation of the gender gap when it comes to leisure. So how does this gap get created? So it doesn't emerge, out of thin air. It doesn't happen naturally. So we can look at different mechanisms, both formal and informal mechanisms, that contribute to this gap between women and men and experiencing gender. So looking at some institutional mechanisms, we can look at law. So again, kind of during this time period, from modernity to today, we can actually highlight laws that have restricted women from entering some leisure spaces, such as restaurants, bars, different types of clubs. So it's easy to see how they would have less opportunities for leisure, less leisure time, if by law you're actually excluding women from participating. You can look at both economic and work arrangements, and how we arrange our economy, how we arrange work, ties into providing people means to actually participate in leisure activities. So for example, providing people money with which they can go out and participate in leisure activities. Often the economy and work arrangement is men are earning those means to participate, and women are being kind of marginalized, not having the real money to go out and participate in leisure activities. Additionally, we can look at workplace policies, which tends to kind of push men out in more public spaces at work, outside of work, and push women into the private space of the home. And when you're in the home, compared to being outside of the home in public spaces, provides you fewer opportunities to participate in leisure. And finally, we can look at the institution of the family. Within the division of labor and the institution of family, again, we see kind of a dichotomy of a private-public. Women can be enforced into the private space, men being pushed out into the public space, and again, that will have consequences for leisure participation. Informal mechanisms, looking at different things of culture and social psychology. Cultural norms for a long time have labeled men, imposed meaning on men of being more public figures, whether it be, again, public in a workplace or public kind of outside the home in a non-workplace. Men are supposed to be the guys kind of out and about, guys being guys, going out and doing leisure activities, whether it be kind of going out for a drink after work, going out during the weekend, hitting around the golf. Men have been defined in comparison to women as kind of the people going out and doing leisure activities. So in comparison to men, women are defined as being more of the homebodies, taking care of the home itself, taking care of children at the home, taking care of the husband at the home. So again, cultural norms have identified women and men differently when it comes to belonging and participating in public and private spaces. And we could say that more informally can have consequences for participating in leisure. Connected to that is self-identity. So when we expect women to focus more on the home life, they actually will start to identify with home life activities more so compared to men. In other words, when you take self-identification measures, women are more likely to measure high in terms of their strength of identifying with the parent role, with the homekeeper role, and the wife role, compared to men are more likely to identify strongly with their work role. And they're kind of outside the home, participating in leisure activities role, more so than the role of being a father, the role of being a parent. And this ties into a third informal mechanism, which I think is important, is guilt. Because studies actually find that often women feel guilty for spending too much, in their minds, too much time outside the home. Women will actually feel guilty for going out and participating in leisure activities when there are things that need to be done at the home with children and perhaps with a husband as well. So there's a sense of guilt that exists in women that does not emerge in men when they're out kind of doing their thing. And so again, I think that guilt is another kind of mechanism that kind of keeps women away from participating in leisure activities, at least to the same amount as men. So here are some numbers we can look at. And here we're looking at some more contemporary figures when it comes to the gender gap. So first, we're going to look at a measure of free time per week. So by Bianchi's study in 2010, she looks at how in the year 2008, fathers reported having 32 free hours per week compared to mothers reporting 31 hours per week. And so at first glance, you may say, it's an hour difference. It's not really a big deal. But, let's multiply that kind of 1 week hour difference over a year. Does anybody have a calculator? Want to do the math for me? 52. Yeah, so 52 hours, and you kind of take that over multiple years, it starts to add up. It starts to be an opportunity provided for men to experience leisure, to experience happiness, and it starts to be an opportunity lost for women to experience leisure and potentially experience happiness. And now we can look at some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, time spent in leisure activities per week. And now we're looking at 2009 to 2013. We're still looking at mothers and fathers, but with an added dimension of full-time workers. And so what we see during this time period, fathers, full-time workers, reported having 26 and a half hours time participating in leisure activities. Mothers, in comparison, reported 22 hours. Again, this is per week. So if you want to add it up, if anybody has a calculator, it's 234. I remember that because it's 234. Easy numbers to remember. So again, it's significant when you add it up over a year and then add it up over multiple years. So this is kind of where we're at now. And in a couple of slides, we're going to go back just a little bit in the past to see how the gap is closing. So when looking at the closing gap, I like to say that the gap used to be much larger, a gap with a capital G. Today, the gap still exists, but not as much in comparison. It has decreased, but still a gap with a lowercase g. So to understand perhaps some of the reasons why we see the gap shrinking, we can look at the same mechanisms we looked at previously. Law. So most of those laws that formerly restricted women from participating in spaces have been changed. And so we don't see the same restrictions placed upon women. They're free to participate in the spaces just as men. We see some changes in how we arrange our economy and our workspaces that are providing women more means to participate in leisure activities. We see new arrangements at the home as well when it comes to men increasing their home labor. And so men, studies have shown, have picked it up. It's not equal yet, but men have picked it up when it comes to childcare and time spent doing house care. Now, childcare for women has basically stayed the same. They're not going to decrease that, it looks like. But they are decreasing the amount of home care that they're doing. So chores around the house has decreased for women as it's increased for men. But child care has increased for women, but you haven't increased for men, but you haven't seen a decrease for women in response. But nevertheless, with all those changes, what you see is free time being open for women today, the gap closing, more opportunities for leisure, more opportunities for happiness, and what we see are cultural changes. And I think it's pretty simple to see that the culture actually reflects the institutions often. So if institutions are arranged to put men out in public spaces, that seems to be normal, and men begin to identify themselves as public figures. And the opposite happens for women. If the institutions kind of push them in the home space, they'll see themselves and other people will see them as being kind of a normal person if they stay within that space. And so cultural norms have changed. That distinction between the public and private figure is not as strong today as it was in the past. People identify differently today compared to the past. And so you see men have begun to identify stronger with the father role, with the role of being a parent compared to the past. And what we see is women, again, they're not decreasing that parent identification, just like they're not decreasing the time spent parenting, but they are identifying more strongly what things are doing outside of the home. For example, as a sports fan or as a kind of food connoisseur, all these things are beginning to kind of bubble up in terms of women are identifying with these things as part of their identity. And when women are identifying with more things today compared to the past, they're not feeling as guilty when they leave the home and participate in leisure. They're not feeling as guilty when they're not at home taking care of the husband, a child, or the home itself. So those are some ways we can look at how the gap has changed over time. And to see this in terms of numbers, we're actually going to step back a little bit and look at 1995. And so when looking at the same information, Bianchi's 2010 set, we see fathers reported having 43 hours of free time per week. Mothers reported having 34 and a half. But then what we need to see is that comparison. So looking at 1995, there was a 8.5 hour gap between the sexes, but now looking at 2008, there's a 1 hour gap. So the gap still exists, but with a lowercase g. There has been progress. The gap is decreasing, and also you can see the same pattern unfold with time spent on leisure activities. Here we're looking at the 2005 to 2009 numbers, and 24 and a half, 18 and a half, but comparing the two, what we saw earlier and what we see now the 6 hour gap per week, and what we saw earlier was a 4.5. So again, we see the gap shrinking a little bit. And so what I want to spend a little bit of time on is theorizing this. And so obviously we can say that those changes of institutions, the family, work economy, law, contribute to the gap shrinking over time. Informal mechanisms also come into play. But I like to look at the culture of contemporary capitalism in America to theorize kind of what we're seeing now and perhaps what we will see in the future and why we may see that. So when looking at capitalism today, we are living in a consumer-driven capitalism, but it's a different type of consumer-driven capitalism compared to 15, 20 years ago. So what we see today are consumers of leisure experiences. And so maybe we can understand that better by looking at previously, kind of beginning in the mid-1970s, we had a shift to a consumption-driven economy, but it was more about consumers buying products. So people buying certain types of clothing, people buying certain brands of cars, people buying certain goods, certain commodities. It was about consumerism, but it was about buying products. Now our consumerism is ingrained in buying leisure experiences. So it's just not about kind of buying a product and going home and eventually using it or putting it on. It's about purchasing an experience. And what you see here is this purchasing of experiences is pulling women away from home spaces. So we can go back even before we were consumer-driven capitalism in the United States, kind of that beginning of modernity, where we were what we call a production-centered capitalist system. And with that production-centered capitalism, we start to get that male in the public space, female in the private space, and the consequences of that arrangement. But then it starts to shift away slowly but surely. And what we start to see around the early 1900s, kind of getting into the 1970s, our economy based upon consumption practices now compared to production practices. But again, it's changed because we don't see that consumption of products being important. What we see is the consumption of experiences. So what we see again is women being pulled away into the economy and public spaces, being a consumer. And what we see now compared to the earlier capitalism of consumption, women are pulled away for longer periods of time. And that's kind of key when talking about time, leisure, and the connection to happiness. So I just have a couple examples that will help us connect the dots. And so first we can look at the significance of female consumers in sports. And so again, we're not looking at somebody kind of buying a product, but more so somebody kind of buying into an overall experience. And that's what you see with a lot of sports. And so the NFL, in addition, NASCAR, have succeeded in terms of the industry because they've been very good at attracting the female consumer market. And so when you look at both NASCAR and NFL, around 40% of their consumers are females, 60% are male. And this has really helped the sports grow in terms of the sport being a business and sustain itself over time. And when you're attracting the female consumer to the game, so you see, I didn't have to search hard and far for these images. I just Googled NFL fans, and there you go. You have the fans, some more normal than others, but you can easily identify both the male and female fans. It's not like looking for a Waldo or anything like that. And you see the same thing with a snapshot of a NASCAR event. You see both male and female spectators there. And the idea is, with this consuming of experiences today, we're bringing women out of the private spaces, and they're getting more quality time spent during leisure activities compared to going out and buying a product, which may take half hour to an hour, depending on how fast you shop. Here we see women going out for sometimes 8 hours a day, tailgating, game, after the game. If you're not physically going to the game, you see women watching games at home or out of the home has increased dramatically as well. So this is one thing we see with that consuming of experience. The businesses need the female consumer to sustain themselves. The businesses need the female consumer to grow, and so they're really trying to market themselves for women, and women are actually being drawn into the experience. They're actually getting higher rates of leisure activity. Now I have horse racing there, not because I'm a big fan of horse racing, but I am, but also because it's a sport that's getting it all wrong. And horse racing, if it continues the way it's going, is not sustainable. There's no growth seen in the near future, and it's because it's having a difficult time attracting the female fan. There's an age problem there as well, but a key problem is attracting and maintaining female fanship. If you look at the Kentucky Derby, if you look at the Breeders' Cup, which is coming up at the end of the month, you'll see a lot of female spectators kind of at the track. But those are exceptions. If you go to a track on a normal day, what you see is this kind of depressing picture of not too many people there, but the people that are there are typically older men. And so what you see, if you do watch commercials, or if you do watch the television programs on the Preakness, on the Derby, and the other big events, they are trying to market themselves heavily to women. They focus kind of sometimes less on the horses and the races, more on the hats. They focus less on the betting and the gambling, more so on the fashion. And this is done intentionally, trying to draw that female consumer into the market because they need them to sustain themselves, to grow in the future. And a second example of this is the craft beer industry. And so this is pretty well known by now. The craft beer industry is growing at significant rates. It's unsustainable at this point, but nevertheless, it's growing really, really fast. And its growth is contributed to a lot of women participating in the craft beer movement. And so the numbers usually say something around 1 in 3 craft beer drinkers are women. And compared to the kind of non-craft, what we call often the macro breweries, the number is usually around 1 in 8, 1 in 9. So again, I don't know about that in terms of the numbers being correct, but I think the gap is true. You see a lot more women participating in the craft beer movement, being part of going out to a bar, being part of using the experience as to bond with friends and stuff like that, compared to kind of non-craft places where typically it's a male-dominated space. So now, what are some consequences of these changes? So first, what we see is when women are increasingly participating in leisure activities, the activities themselves become degendered. And by degendered, we simply don't see the activity as a male thing or a female thing. It's just a person thing. It's an activity that people like to do rather than a guy likes to do it or a girl likes to do it. Another consequence we see is the continuing decrease of the gap between the sexes. So again, if my framework is correct, as long as we're in the stage of a consumer-driven capitalism based upon consuming experiences, and women are a big part of that market, we're going to see that gap continue to close between men and women when it comes to time spent in leisure activities. And so I think we can also argue that maybe there's some greater benefits for women, and this is twofold. The first benefit, obviously, is the more opportunities they're going to have. If they're being marketed to, if they're being courted, as a consumer, as a potential leisure participator, then they're going to have more opportunities to participate in leisure. Thus, they're going to have more opportunities for happiness. So that's a benefit. And a second benefit, we could say, is they actually may have better quality leisure experiences compared to men. In other words, when you look at such thing as going to a football game, men and women going to the same game, maybe in the same group of people, actually have a different experience. Men are more concerned about kind of the game itself, how the players play, who wins the game, who loses the game. And a lot of their happiness, after the game itself is dependent upon, how well the players do, how well your team does. Women, on the other hand, are not as influenced in terms of their happiness when it comes to who wins the game or who plays well. They actually concentrate more on the socializing, the seeing people they won't see the rest of the week, the talking to people, the catching up that they do during the game experience, rather than focusing on the game itself. Now, we don't want to say they don't care, they don't have a team, because they do. But again, they're concentrating on other dimensions of the experience rather than solely focusing on who wins, who plays well. And the same thing holds true with the craft beer movement. What you see compared to men, women actually like to talk about the beers more. They'll try, they'll taste, they will compare, and they will discuss. And men will do the same things, but sometimes it's more about kind of the drinking experience itself. Trying to catch a buzz, perhaps trying to catch a big buzz, and enjoy yourself while doing it. Women, not saying they don't want to catch a buzz, but there's other aspects they also emphasize during the drinking experience. The time spent with friends, the time spent with family members, the conversations during those time periods. And when you're focusing on those things, the social interactions, you actually get a higher happiness kind of balance out of it, rather if you're just focusing on kind of the drinking or the game itself. So I'll leave that there, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Weis.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm going to come at the question of happiness from a slightly different perspective. There we go. The overall conference obviously is called The Essentials of Happiness. And so one of the things I'd like to ask you to think about, not just right now, but for the rest of the conference and for the rest of your lives perhaps, is what are the essentials of happiness? For me, taking the title and putting it into a series of questions, what are the relationships, the broad relationships between gender and public policy? How is, as Ryan suggested in terms of leisure, how is gender related to happiness? Are there forms, gendered forms of happiness? And what's the relationship between happiness and public policy? So these are some of the things I'll be looking at. The pursuit of happiness as a key word in the title of this panel certainly draws me, and I suspect many of us in the room, back to the Declaration of Independence and the phrase within that of the pursuit of happiness, as opposed in particular to the pursuit of property. But when we think about the pursuit of happiness, we can go backward in time, and as an historian, of course, I'm interested in going backward in time, to philosophers like Epicurus, who we think about in this context because Thomas Jefferson identified with that school of thought. And we can also look ahead. If you were to Google, as I know students are fond of doing, the pursuit of happiness, not just the Declaration of Independence pops up, but there's many references to a recent movie, The Pursuit of Happiness, even though obviously happiness, excuse me, spelled differently in both of those. So I'd like to suggest to you that 1776 in the United States Declaration of Independence is a major turning point in the history of happiness. Going back to philosophy and religion, what are some definitions we can throw out to think about in terms of happiness? Aristotle, happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. So we might consider a goal for ourselves to be successful. And then again, another related question is, what's the relationship between success and happiness? Some of you would recognize the Dalai Lama. If you want others to be happy, he would urge us to practice compassion. If we ourselves want to be happy, he comes back and tells us also to practice compassion. So everybody's in the happiness business. If you read the program, you open it up to the front, you know that. We have the science of happiness today. We also have increasingly the neuroscience of happiness. We can study our brain and we can begin to think about what are the experiences that bring us pleasure and happiness, and how can we tell that by looking at the brain. There are many people who are interested in creating a culture of happiness, especially in the workplace. Especially in the workplace. For example, what is the link between a happy employee and a thriving organization? There are thousands of consultants that are meeting with CEOs of businesses to encourage them to create workplaces where it is easier for employees to be happy, because they'll say to them, you know what, the bottom line is going to be better if your employees are happy. Example, Harvard Business Review, the value of happiness, how employee well-being drives profits. What I'd like to call your attention to in the Harvard Business Review issue is another synonymous term for happiness that we see increasingly, particularly in public policy, is well-being. So happiness and well-being aren't identical, but these terms are often used interchangeably. And we think about subjective well-being as a common phrase, SWB, subjective meaning not just what somebody else is going to measure objectively, but people's reporting themselves. As Dr. Bagchi said, are you happy? People being asked that question. Are you happy? What makes you happy? And not necessarily objective measures like how many years of education you have, what your income is, and even how many hours of leisure you have. It's about the quality of the experience that people self-report. Many of you know from the program or from other sources that in 1972, Bhutan, a country, suggested, you know what? The gross national happiness is actually more important than the gross national product. And the gross national happiness here, we say, what are the components of gross national happiness? Living standards, psychological well-being, health, how we use our time, our education, cultural diversity and resilience, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity, and resilience. In 2010, Seattle created its own kind of gross national happiness movement, the Happiness Alliance, the home of the Happiness Initiative. There's things called the Happiness Project, a Gross National Happiness Index Survey. There are many different measures around the world for happiness. As I said, everybody's in the happiness business today. If you look at those image on the left, you'll see that many of these measures are measures that are developed by particular countries. There are also measures that are developed on the right-hand side. With the excerpt from our program is from the World Happiness Report, which is put out by the UN, and that's really what I want to talk about today with you. This is a 2012 survey report, survey results. There are more than 84 countries, but I only had room for 84. So I didn't want to highlight the unhappy countries in the world. United States, first in our hearts, maybe, but number 15 on the list. Number 15 on the list. Significantly, the countries in Scandinavia, which will be no surprise to some of us, are in the top 15. Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden. We might say to ourselves, so why are those countries so overwhelmingly among the happiest countries? What is it about the way those countries are organized that makes people in those countries happy? This is a gender happiness gap, and I have to tell you, I looked at this and I thought, you know, I don't know that I really even understand this map. So I'm not really going to talk about it that much. I think I'm going to need to study it a little bit more. And I'm going to probably need to read the entire World Happiness Report before I can say much of significance. A little note on method. So one of the sources I do use a lot in my research and in my teaching is UN Women. And I would recommend it to you. It's very easy, unwomen, all one word, .org. And I went to the site, and I said to myself, so what does UN Women have to say about happiness? So I put happiness in the search bar, and we're going to look at what I came up with. There were 9 references to happiness, and I put them, as an historian, in chronological order. So when we think about Bhutan, we say, wow, isn't that great? You know, the heck with the gross national product. We're interested in gross national happiness. So the results from Bhutan say, you know what? If you want to maximize gross national happiness, you're not going to be able to do that until and unless you create strategies for doing 2 things. Educating women as a baseline, and then, as a result of that, enhancing their positions in both society, in the broad world of leisure and family and community and neighborhood, but also in the world, in the economy, in the world of work. That if women are not happy at home and at work, nobody's happy. You've heard that expression, if mama ain't happy, no one's happy. If women are not happy, the world is not a happy place. And right now, with majority of the poor in the world being women and children, we can see the connection between poverty and global happiness. When we think about women in work, getting back to the spheres that Dr. Orr was talking about, women are involved obviously increasingly in the paid economy, in the wage economy, but they also continue to be involved in the informal trade sector. And unless there is attention to women's involvement in the informal trade sector, economic development and global happiness will not really occur. As Michelle Bachelet said, making trade work for women. So women who are working part-time, perhaps working at home. Again, thinking about looking outside the United States for a moment, we can look at the experience of Chile. In terms of democratic transition, because one of the questions we might have, as many societies are undergoing transitions, our own here at Millersville, the university's changing all the time, and so one of the questions we might ask ourselves at here at campus, in the Commonwealth, we look at the budget, and we ask ourselves, how is this budget addressing issues of gender equality? When we think about revolutions, societies that are making transitions from dictatorships to democracies in particular, what role do women have in that? And so we think about that, we can think about the pathway to development and what roles women have. How are women involved in those pathways to development? Again, further reflections, if we think about looking at the Middle East right now, which is obviously a critical part of our world, we can think about comparing the transitions that have taken place, for example, in Eastern Europe. Some of you may not be old enough to remember being alive when the Berlin Wall came down. But we think about how in Eastern Europe there's been transformations of previous communist countries that are now trying to pursue other pathways. So we have different parts of the world are going through these transitions, many of them attempting to move towards democratic forms of government. What are some of the kinds of things that women are doing to create well-being? Again, that's a code word for happiness. And particularly, what are young women doing? Palestinians trying to bring about peace. A 24-year-old man from Tanzania won a t-shirt design contest. He climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. He led the Caravan for Change. The issue for him was violence against women. So what are young people doing around the world? We know that peace and happiness go hand in hand. And so if there's an absence of peace, there's going to be an absence of happiness. In a world where there is violence against women, that's not a happy place. Legal help leads women to brighter futures. And so we think about land rights and social protection benefits. Social protection benefits are one of the reasons why many of the Scandinavian countries are in the upper tier of happy countries, because they provide things like paid parental leave for men and for women. They make it easier for people to combine family and work. So there's lots of folks doing things around the world. As some of you know, UN sponsors International Day to End Violence Against Women, followed by almost 2 weeks of activism against gender violence. One fact to pull out of this: the status of violence against women continues to be calamitous. 120 million, let me say that one more time, 120 million girls have experienced forced sexual acts. It's estimated that half of all women killed each year are killed at the hands of intimate partner or family member. So this young woman says, when I was 7 years old, I was sexually abused by my uncle. I thought it was my fault, but somehow I had allowed this to happen. I never told anyone. I was silent. I did, however, unsurprisingly, begin to act out. As a result, my mother made sure we didn't see my uncle anymore, but no one ever asked exactly what had happened. We maintained silence. Forced silence, again, is not compatible with happiness. Violence against women, non-consensual sex, silence that is forced or coerced is not compatible with happiness. Moving from the private space in which much violence against women takes place, this response is to take that and put it in a very public place, in a very gendered public place, which is a sports stadium. So this artist hung thousands of dresses in the football stadium as a tribute, in this instance, to women who were, and men who were victims of sexual violence that occurred in during the course of war. It's also another time when there is high incidence of rape, which had not always been considered a war crime, but now is considered a war crime. People across the country donated more than 5,000 skirts and dresses to contribute to this installation. This is fairly recent. This happened this summer. So now, bringing it down a little closer to home, the Global Youth Agenda, and just almost 2 weeks ago, Malawi chief annuls 330 child marriages. In June, this past summer, senior chief annulled 330 customary marriages. 175 were girl wives and 155 were boy fathers, Malawi. The objective of annulling child marriage is to encourage the youth, both boys and girls, to return to school and to continue a healthy childhood. One young girl was married at 15, she became pregnant, she dropped out of school. I've seen the evils of getting married at a young age. When I think about it now, I realize that getting married at such a young age isn't a good thing. I want you to listen carefully to this next sentence. When I read it, it shocked me. And see if you can see why it might have shocked me. At the end of the day, we still lack the things that brought us into marriage in the first place, like soap, lotion, and other basic items. With your person sitting next to you, why do you think I might find that? Not that you can jump inside my head, but why might that sentence be surprising, shocking? At the end of the day, we still lack the things that brought us into marriage in the first place, like soap, lotion, and other basic items. Person sitting next to you, what do you think that sentence means? Okay, at the end of the day, we still lack the things that brought us to marriage in the first place. Soap, lotion, other basic items. What's going on here? Come on, somebody has an idea. Yes?
The dowry.
Okay, what about the dowry?
The dowry from the woman's family, it, like, their parents are giving it to the men, but like, and his family, but then it's all gone. They
culture, we would assume that marriage is one of the happy places, and that people expect to find, to discover happiness within a marital relationship. If we think about marriage as it often is, as a relationship, an economic relationship, and if people are trying to get basic goods like soap, let's say in order to get soap or toothpaste, you had to get married to get it. Because you didn't have enough money yourself to go out and buy soap and toothpaste. You had to marry somebody who then would give you soap and toothpaste. That kind of dependency is not a happy place. That kind of economic dependency, where people enter into relationships of work or family from a position of dependency, does not generate happiness. Imagine if you live in a situation where in order to get something as basic as soap and toothpaste, shampoo, deodorant, you had to marry somebody and then be subject to them in that state of dependency. Okay, so what can we do here at Millersville to promote gender equality and the happiness of women? I would say those are tied in pretty closely together. Number one, of course, we can get involved now here. At the university, the Women's Studies minor is one place for involvement. There are numerous programs at the Center for Health Education and Promotion, and also the Women's Commission are 3 places on campus where men and women can get involved to help to promote gender equality on campus, promote the happiness not only of women, but also the happiness of men and women. For example, some of you know that Millersville Center for Health Education and Promotion worked together with the Lancaster YWCA to have Walk a Mile in Her Shoes. Anybody know what Walk a Mile in Her Shoes is? That event? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I participated.
Okay, it's the idea that everybody has a stake in ending violence against women. Not just women, but men and women. And so one of the suggestions from the UN is to join some local organization as they walk, which is a typical form of engagement. We have all been involved in a walk or a run to raise money, to bring visibility to an issue, in this case, the issue to end violence against women and girls. So it's another possibility, moving beyond campus to the community of Lancaster City and Lancaster County. Lancaster City, I don't think Lancaster City is a CEDAW city, and CEDAW is a UN acronym for the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. So maybe on the left, Millersville students could partner on the right with Lancaster City, and we could say, we want Lancaster to be a CEDAW city. That is, we want Lancaster to become a city that is committed to ending discrimination and violence against women. And the university could be a leader in that effort. Who's the person on the left? Emma Watson, right, Emma Watson. The He for She campaign. Click on that, join Emma Watson supporting the He for She campaign. I asked somebody, does Millersville have a He for She campaign? Anybody know the answer? If we have one, it's a very under the radar He for She campaign. I don't think we have one yet. I would love it to say, you know, the next policy conference, we can report that Millersville does have the He for She conference, that Lancaster has become a CEDAW city. One other thing, UN Women has campus chapters. In other words, they're organized in cities and college campuses to pursue this agenda of gender equality and the end to violence against women. I thought that the testimony from the woman who started the chapter at the University of Virginia would be a good way to close my remarks. She said, my university, UVA, has this big university. Again, we're going back to Thomas Jefferson, right? Okay. Over 700 student organizations. But she said, you know what? We didn't have any organizations that were directed to improving the prospects of poor women. I started this organization at UVA because I think as a student at a modern university and as a citizen of a developed society, that we have the responsibility and the opportunity to help improve the standing of women around the world. In the 21st century, women continue to be at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. She would argue because of patriarchy and the lack of resources. We could have another conversation about why women seem to be at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. But she said, you know what, I have an opportunity to get a higher education. I have the hope of a promising career. I think I want to work with other people to make sure that other people have some of those possibilities as well. So that's all that I have to say. I'm going to hand the microphone, that's not really a microphone, back to Dr. Bagchi.
Okay, questions? Do you guys have before questions, Dr. Weis didn't say this, but vote. I'm a political scientist, so I have to throw this out there. That's the other thing you can do, vote. Make sure you vote, you pay attention, read up on people's stances and vote. And now questions. Do you have questions for Dr. Weis, for Dr. Orr?
No comments.
Or comments?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the talks. I think just following up on your last statement about voting, I mean, so public policy is also built on public ideology and what people believe about the organization of work and family roles. And so, you start off by saying conservatives blame feminism for women's rising expectations. I mean, if you step back and think about that, expectations about what? About being equal to men. I mean, just absorb that for a second. I mean, that's so inherently not political. And yet, I think the thing that when you think about public policy more broadly is the way our lives are structured around work and family. If those arrangements are disadvantaging women's capacity to do both in a way that then subsequently affects leisure. So let's say they have leisure hours, but they're so exhausted by the nature of those roles. And in some ways, even if you establish equality in leisure hours, the actual quality of those leisure hours might not be enhanced because of the continual ideologies about the way women and men try to juggle or balance work and family. So I guess it's more of a comment that when we think about voting and you think about statements, the way things actually will really change is being very careful about how you think about public ideologies and how those shape what political actors are going to do. And again, really step back and rising expectations for what? Equality, being equal to men. I mean, that's essentially what feminism is about. But if you unpack that, it's about the quality of the roles in work and family. And if women are still doing the vast majority of the labor at home and counting some of that as leisure, essentially what we're saying is, women, check your expectations, but do we say that to men? Think about it. Like, we don't say, men, check your expectations and make sure they're aligning accurately. We say that for women, and that's fundamental, and that's a real structural thing. Anyway, just a comment to sort of piggyback off of the vote idea.
I have a question, thinking about what we started with, and like this, that women have been reporting less happiness. If we thought about the campus, would you say that female students are less happy than male students? In other words, do the arrangements of our daily lives in this place lead to an outcome where it's easier for women to be happy than it is for men to be happy? Or do you think this is an equal campus, everybody's equally happy or unhappy? Is there any difference? Is there any arrangement that's going to promote happiness for some people on this campus, but not for all? Yeah.
My wheels are turning, but I don't know. I just think like what you guys are saying about some women say that like raising children and stuff is leisurely. Like some don't. Some do not find that like leisurely, and that's a job. And like maybe they would have more fun if they could get out and like take classes and like do yoga or something. So like just that like natural occupation that we are born with, like that's our responsibility. So there's like a certain level like men may or may not have one leg up on certain women. You
Well, caring, whether it's for children or for elders, is work, it's labor.
Exactly.
But even today, sometimes we talk to people of my generation, maybe even younger people, and the question is, do you work? Usually it's a question directed to women, because it's assumed that men do work. When we're asked, do you work? And even today, there are people who reply, no, I don't work. I stay home and take care of the children. And that's an internalized notion that caring for children somehow is not work. And maybe it's not valued, perhaps because it's not wage. Anybody else? Yes.
As far as that wage goes, and I know I talked about this with Dr. Orr, as far as that wage goes, we see those Scandinavian countries being happier in nature, though we also can correlate, I guess you could say, to them also having not only maternal leave, but also
Paternal leave.
overall. We can see that kind of balance of happiness between men and women in that, because men are also getting that time off to be with their kids, and also kind of them allowing them to also help raise the kids while the mom has some individual time for themselves.
What happens in some families is if you expect the woman to be the one who takes care of the children, and the woman leaves a wage position, sometimes the other adult in that household, if there is another adult, has to work more to replace those lost wages, and then that person doesn't have any time to see or be involved in the care of children, and that's an impoverishment for that person as well. So yes, their laws are changed, but then again, we think about culture being changed and values being changed. Because I think sometimes it was very difficult, even though a man had paternity leave, to take it. Because sometimes he was accused of not being serious about his job.
Well, academics have done studies where if you have two academics in a family and one takes maternity leave and the other takes paternity leave, right? And they found overwhelmingly that if women take maternity leave, right, at the end of that they just come back and they resume from wherever they left off. The men almost always after paternity leave will publish something, article, book, whatever. And you say, well, how did you publish while you were, holding a screaming baby for, 9 hours? As a person who has 3 kids, trust me, it's work. And the reason is because men can take paternity leave, but they almost overwhelmingly seem to use it to further research agendas. It becomes almost a form of sabbatical, whereas for women, it is raising the kid. And so, I think this is the cultural aspect, right? The culture says, well, the mother has to take care of the baby. This is not just American culture. I'm from India. And when I had my first kid, my mother called me up and said, and so are you quitting your job? And I said, absolutely not. I have worked very hard to get a PhD and there is no way I'm quitting my job. And she said, well, are you okay with other people raising your kids? And that's the understanding. If you put the kid in daycare, that means you're letting other people raise it. But if a father does that, that is, but he has to work, right? So culturally, I think public policy, you're right, is one thing. Culture is another, but the two of them are very closely tied.
Well, yeah, just to follow up, so I just flew in from Canada, and we were 5th on that list of happy. And I'm doing research up there. I'll talk about some of it tomorrow. But when we ask women, so we study that, we ask women, we ask men in qualitative interviews and surveys, the women sort of sacrifice more of their time to family members and absorb that. So even the definitions of like free time, like what's really free? It's not as though it's pure uninterrupted time. Like you can just be on a beach, quietly sitting there, relaxing for hours of uninterrupted time, really rejuvenating, versus you're kind of piecing together like 15 minutes here. And those are the stories that women tell us and then men, it's completely different. Again, sociologists generalize, that's what we do. So it's not the same for everybody, but in general. But what's more fascinating is what I was getting at was as students and individuals who are going to probably get into these roles, it's the way the women, these are well-educated professional women, often tend to slide back into describing those as natural. That term comes up repeatedly, and it's not. That's what I'm getting at about the mindset. It's like those mindsets drive the way people think about policy, right? Like women should be doing this, men should be doing that. And so that just perpetuates the arrangements. And again, these are well-intentioned women and men. They're not bad, but it's almost like we've fallen into these kinds of, and this is in Canada, which is more egalitarian than the US. I'm from the US and I moved there, and that's one thing you notice. And still, even in that society, it's higher up in happiness. But, yeah. So anyway, just that's sort of what I was meaning by the public policy thing. It starts kind of the way people think.
I think it's not causal, so it's kind of intertwined, and it's very hard to separate those threads, right? What comes from public policy? Public policy is dictated by culture, but then culture then can be influenced by public policy, so it's kind of this real mix. But yes, I'm sorry, go ahead. Questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, views? Yeah.
It's sort of a personal anecdote / question to the group. So, my partner, the man that I'm with, we are very serious about potentially having children soon. And he is less career motivated than I am. I'm the more career motivated one of the two of us. He sees work as he needs to have a job. It's work, but he's not as career motivated. He's not pursuing his doctorate or anything like that. And we've been discussing having children, and I've talked about the inevitable impacts that would have on my career. And he's identified with wanting to be the primary child care. My question to the group is, realistically, with the way society is set up, with the way the workforce is set up, is that even really possible? Is it really going to be possible for him to take on the majority of that burden as the primary caregiver while still probably having to work part-time at least? Or is it going to end up being sort of this ruse where in reality I'm still the primary caregiver even though we're calling it something different? Do you know?
Tracy?
Yeah.
Right.
She's in charge.
Sorry. I feel as though at first he's going to start off fine, but then I feel like you're going to be taking control of the second shift. You're going to be also taking care of the children and working full time eventually, because I just feel as though women we're naturally equipped to like take care of children versus a man. There are some men out there who can, but at the same time I feel like they fall off a little bit. So it's like totally up to you, but you're definitely going to be taking control of the second shift. I know that for a fact.
I know with that kind of experience as a man, when if there's a primary caregiver, it plays into a little bit of what's known as the family myth, where we're saying that he's the primary caregiver, and you might end up being that, but it also kind of depends on how you two interpret that yourselves. You might feel one way, but it's also the communication between you two that's also often going to decide that. So you have to kind of decide between yourselves and not let society to say, okay, just because he's only doing this does not mean he's only the secondary, he's only the primary caregiver. It's something that has to be interpreted between what you guys believe in your family myth and what's actually happening.
I think my question, and I appreciate your answer, I think my question was more, are the institutions that we interact with, our jobs, the law, and all those types of things, are they set up to support that? Is more what I was asking. Do you understand? Do you know
When you find out when something happens, if there's a sick child, and then who is able to take an emergency situation? Somebody has to. We need a parent. So we need a parent here. We need a parent here. Who can leave their job? And then what happens? But whatever the laws are, what's the cultural context for that? What's the response? Are people who leave their colleagues say, "Oh, of course, absolutely," or "Wait a minute, don't you have somebody else who can do that? That's not really what you're supposed to be doing. I thought you had a wife. Doesn't that child have a mother? Is this really the father's role to do that? We have a big project. You can't leave now."
Right, and I think that's more what I'm referring to.
Well, I think are we right that you're gonna discover that in those moments?
Yeah.
I think, you'll both encounter more barriers, formal within institutions in terms of maternity, if he gets to leave or if you get to leave when a child is born. So that's something you want to look into in terms of your future employment. So, what are their policies based upon paternal leave versus maternal leave? Because if their policy is only directed towards women getting time off work, then that's going to pull you back into the home, and as a consequence, that will push them outside of the home, going against what you guys are trying to do. Culturally, you'll see some barriers as well. Family members, his side, your side, will maybe ask him certain questions, ask you certain questions that wouldn't be asked otherwise if the roles were reversed. But it's possible. I mean, I always like to bring up the idea of a single parent. A single mother or a single father does all the parenting. So sometimes we dive into, that myth of parenting being natural for one person or another. But all we have to do is look at a good single parent. And no matter the sex of that parent, we can see parenting is a person thing rather than a male-female thing. Some people are good at it, some people are not. It's not so much being born a male or female, but being able to take on the role and really want to do well at it. That's more important than being a guy or being a girl. And so I think you're right, there are going to be barriers there, and that's probably why your question came. You wouldn't think of that question if it was the reverse. You'll see barriers, but you can make it work. And it'll be extra work, but still it can be done. And the more people that make it work, the less obstacles people will face in the future.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Weis and Dr. Orr. Thank you guys for coming.